Bugatti Chiron Per Sport. But there's one thing now that's really slowing us down. I can't believe that's how it comes up. Body panels. Since Bugatti decided early on they wasn't going to sell us any parts for this car.
What happens when one of YouTube's most fearless car builders takes on another impossible Bugatti? After proving the critics wrong by rebuilding a crashed Chiron, Matt Armstrong returned with a neglected Bugatti Veyron that refused to stay running. What looked like a simple repair quickly turned into a mystery involving a manufacturer recall nobody expected, unexpected Volkswagen parts inside a $2 million hypercar, and a fix that didn't actually solve the problem. Even Bugatti's own support couldn't provide the answers Matt needed. So how did he uncover the truth? And what does it reveal about owning one of the world's most exclusive cars? The hypercar that kept fighting back. Matt Armstrong already had a reputation before this Veyron ever entered his garage. He'd built it rebuilding wrecked exotic cars other mechanics wouldn't touch.
Here we go with the Venom wide-body Bugatti Chiron. Each part we're unbolting than the standard part.
Most famously, a Bugatti Chiron that Bugatti's own chief executive, Mate Rimac, said couldn't be saved. The Veyron was his second Bugatti, a repossessed car bought for significantly less than the roughly $2 million it would cost in working condition. It arrived with a list of problems long enough to fill a service ticket on its own. A gearbox that refused to engage, a leak somewhere in the cooling system, wiring nobody had inspected in years. The first fix came almost embarrassingly easy. The no-gear issue.
But it had to be an impulse because we had to commit. But I can't believe I'm saying this. The Bugatti Veyron is coming into the garage. My Bugatti Veyron.
The kind of fault that usually means a 5- or 6-figure repair bill on a car like this turned out to be a blown fuse. A $3 part solved a problem that should have cost more than most cars are worth outright. Is that the kind of story that ends there, with a cheap part and a happy ending? It rarely is, and this one didn't. A blown fuse doesn't fail on its own. It sacrifices itself to protect a circuit from something worse happening behind it. And that's exactly what the team found once they looked closer. Behind the melted fuse sat a hydraulic gearbox pump, with wiring that had been baked brittle by heat. The plastic casing perished from running harder than it was ever meant to. The pump itself was the same component used to raise and lower an ordinary road car's roof mechanism.
Pump is installed on a hydraulic gearbox of a construction equipment. So that's the gearbox of a backhoe loader machine.
Working overtime inside a hypercar application it was never quite built for. Then came the radiator, weeping coolant from a pinhole leak. Fixing it the way Bugatti intended meant dismantling most of the front end. Wings, headlights, potentially the entire suspension frame. Armstrong went a different way, running a sealant through the cooling circuit instead. A fix purists would wince at, and a fix that, on this particular circuit, actually held. None of that prepared the team for what came next. Fresh off those repairs, the Veyron developed a new fault, and this one didn't behave like anything they'd already diagnosed.
The strange thing that I found out is that during a service on the Bugatti Veyron, around the material forming a solid plug that repairs the hole.
The engine would fire, run for almost exactly 2 seconds, and shut off completely, as if someone had reached in and pulled the plug. Why does a car dying on a timer feel more unsettling than one that simply won't start at all? Because a random failure suggests bad luck. A failure that repeats itself with that kind of precision suggests something is actively deciding to kill the engine, and that's a very different problem to chase down. The early symptoms pointed toward an immobilizer fault, the car starting on residual fuel already in the lines, then cutting out the moment it failed to verify the key. It was a reasonable theory, and also, as it turned out, not quite the right one. Running 2 Bugatti rebuilds at once raises the stakes on a project like this in ways that aren't always obvious from the outside. Every hour spent chasing a 2-second death on the Veyron is an hour not spent on the Chiron. And every wrong diagnostic turn risks damaging a car that's already worth more than most houses. Why take on a second impossible project before the first one is finished? Because the pattern that makes Armstrong's channel worth watching isn't fixing one hard car. It's proving that the hardest cars in the world are still just machines, governed by wiring diagrams and part numbers rather than mystique. A 2-second death is exactly the kind of problem that tests that premise directly, in real time, with no guarantee of a clean answer at the end. There's also a simpler, more human layer to why this particular fault stung. The team had already cleared the gearbox, already solved the radiator, already gotten the car driving under its own power for the first time since the repossession.
The engineering company is successfully tapping into the niche world of motorsports, and it needs workers.
Around 90 high-performance gearboxes.
A new fault appearing after all of that isn't just a technical setback. It's the kind of moment that tests whether a project like this actually has an endpoint, or whether every solved problem simply reveals the next one waiting underneath it. Does chasing an intermittent fault like this ever feel like progress while it's happening? Rarely. And that's exactly what makes the eventual answer land as hard as it does. The part that solved the mystery. Diagnosing a 2-second death on a car this complicated isn't a 5-minute job. It meant tracing wiring, checking sensor after sensor, ruling out one system after another until only one component was left standing at the center of the fault. Eventually, the team unplugged the fuel pump control module entirely.
Installing a fuel pump control module on a 2.0T Mark V. Okay, so before we get into our install, real quick, briefly about this fuel pump control module.
Expecting the car to refuse to start at all without it. Instead, the Veyron ran. It ran badly. Flashing engine light, a fuel gauge reading nothing at all, throttle response barely present, but it ran, continuously, without dying at the 2-second mark. Removing the module hadn't disabled the car, it had cured it. That single result told the team almost everything they needed to know. If unplugging a part fixes a symptom instead of causing a new one, the part itself was never doing its job correctly in the first place. It was actively sending bad information that killed the engine on schedule. Does a car running worse but longer count as progress? In diagnostic terms, absolutely, because a controlled failure you understand is infinitely more useful than an intermittent one you don't. There's a specific kind of relief that comes with isolating a fault like this, and it's worth naming honestly. Before the module came out, every possibility on the table was expensive, invasive, or both. A wiring harness replacement meant hours of disassembly. A fuel system fault meant potentially pulling the tank. An engine management issue meant a level of software access most independent mechanics simply don't have. Narrowing 70 possible causes down to one specific module, confirmed by a test anyone could understand, is the difference between a repair with an actual endpoint and a repair that could have swallowed weeks with no guarantee of resolution. For anyone watching this play out rather than living it, there's something almost satisfying about a diagnosis this clean. Most car problems on ordinary vehicles resolve into a single sentence. A sensor, a hose, a belt. Hypercar problems rarely offer that kind of simplicity, because so few people have ever actually worked on one, and even fewer have documented the process in public. What does it mean when a $2 million diagnostic mystery gets solved with the same basic logic used on a used sedan? Unplug it, watch what happens, trust the result. It means the car isn't nearly as mysterious as its price tag suggests, even when the part behind the fault turns out to be anything but ordinary. With the faulty module isolated, the obvious next step was ordering a replacement. That's where the story stopped being a routine repair and turned into something else entirely. Stamped directly onto the module's housing was a part number, the kind of detail easy to overlook, buried in raised digits on a piece of metal nobody photographs for a highlight reel. Armstrong searched it anyway. What came back wasn't a simple listing of a replacement part and its price. It was an official recall document, sitting in a manufacturer database, tied to that exact component. Why would a routine parts search return a government-adjacent filing instead of a shopping cart? Because the part number wasn't just identifying a component. It was identifying a known problem, one significant enough that Bugatti had already been forced to formally acknowledge it. A part number is supposed to be the most boring piece of information on an entire car. This one turned out to be the most important thing in the whole diagnosis, and nobody in the process had been looking for it on purpose. The recall that changed everything. The recall document did more than confirm a single faulty part. It confirmed a pattern. According to the filing, 72 Bugatti Veyrons and Grand Sports had been affected by this exact failure. The same fuel pump control module, the same 2-second death, repeated across dozens of cars that had nothing else in common except the parts sitting behind their fuel systems. This wasn't an isolated defect unique to one abused example. It was a known issue, documented, tracked, and supposedly already addressed. That last word carries most of the weight in this story. Supposedly. Bugatti's fix for the affected module was a software revision, version v3.03, meant to correct whatever logic error was causing the fuel pump signal to fail. Was that enough to close the case entirely? It should have been. Mats Veyron already had that exact revised version installed when the 2-second death started happening anyway. Sit with that for a moment. A car manufacturer identified a fault serious enough to issue a formal recall across dozens of vehicles, released a fix specifically engineered to solve it, and the fix still wasn't enough to stop the same failure from resurfacing on a car that had already received it. Does that mean the software update was worthless? Not necessarily. It may have addressed part of the underlying issue without eliminating every condition that could trigger it. What it does mean is that a documented, acknowledged, supposedly corrected fault had found its way back into a customer's car regardless, and nobody along the way had flagged it before Armstrong's own diagnostic work turned it up. There's a difference worth being precise about here, the kind of distinction a careful investigation has to hold on to. This wasn't a hidden defect Bugatti tried to bury. It's a documented recall, filed and searchable, exactly the way the system is supposed to work. The failure wasn't secrecy. The failure was durability, a fix that existed on paper and in software, installed correctly, and still didn't hold up against whatever was actually going wrong inside that module. A recall proves a manufacturer knew about a problem. It doesn't automatically prove the problem got solved. Think about what this means for the other 71 cars named in that same filing. If Mats Veyron already had the corrected module installed and still failed at the 2-second mark, how many of those other owners are driving around with the same false sense of security, trusting a fix that resolved the recall on paper without necessarily resolving it under the hood? There's no way to know from a single case how widespread the recurring failure actually is. What's clear is that at least one confirmed instance exists of the official remedy not holding, and that's the kind of detail that rarely makes it back into any owner's inbox once a recall gets marked closed. Does a closed recall actually mean the danger is gone, or does it just mean the paperwork is? It's worth being careful about what can and can't be concluded from one failed fix. A single case doesn't prove the software revision was worthless across all 72 affected cars. It's entirely possible the update solved the issue for most of them, and Mats Veyron simply has an additional variable the others don't share, whether that's age, prior repair history, or a component that degraded further after the update was applied. What the case does prove, without any need for speculation, is that recalled and updated isn't automatically the same thing as fixed forever. Every owner who assumes a closed recall means a closed case is trusting a piece of paperwork over the actual behavior of their own car. What made this discovery land so hard wasn't the paperwork itself. It was the process that led there. A $3 fuse, a melted wiring harness, a 2-second death, and finally a number stamped into a piece of metal that almost nobody would have bothered to check, cracking open a story that had been sitting in a filing system the entire time. The parts nobody expected. The recall wasn't the only surprise waiting inside this car. Working through the Veyron's other systems, Armstrong kept running into the same pattern. Components marketed as exclusive, engineered specifically for one of the most expensive cars ever built, turning out to be something far more ordinary underneath the badge. The hydraulic pump behind the earlier gearbox fault wasn't a bespoke Bugatti part manufactured in tiny numbers for a handful of hypercars. It was the exact same component fitted to the roof mechanism on an ordinary road-going Audi, pressed into service inside a machine built to chase world speed records. The spark plugs checked out as standard NGK components, identical to plugs found in cars that cost a fraction of the Veyron's price. And the accumulator tanks, a component most owners would assume had been engineered from scratch for a car this exclusive, turned out to be shared with the Volkswagen Lupo, one of the smallest, most unremarkable hatchbacks Volkswagen has ever produced. Does that discovery diminish what the Veyron actually is? Not really, and it's worth being fair about why. Sharing components across a manufacturing group is standard practice throughout the entire auto industry, from budget hatchbacks all the way up to 8-figure hypercars. It keeps costs manageable and reliability high on parts that don't need to be unique to do their job well. What made this particular case land differently was the gap between the story Bugatti tells about the car and the reality sitting under its skin. A brand built entirely around exclusivity, engineering perfection, and a price tag that assumes every component is bespoke, quietly relying on the same tank that sits under the hood of one of the cheapest cars Volkswagen has ever built. That gap became financially very real, very quickly. A factory service on a Veyron of this kind can run past $25,000, largely because the badge attached to every part inflates the labor and the parts markup alike. Once Armstrong understood which components were genuinely shared, standard pieces rather than bespoke ones, an entire service that would normally run tens of thousands of dollars came down to a fraction of that figure. Is that a loophole, or is it just an honest accounting of what these parts actually are? It's closer to the second. A mechanic doing what a dealership already knows and simply doesn't advertise. The comparison gets sharper once the actual numbers sit side by side. A dealership quote built around exclusive Bugatti pricing treats every component as though it were machined specifically for that one car, justifying a bill that runs into the tens of thousands before labor is even factored in. The same repair, sourced through the correct cross-referenced part numbers, can land in the low thousands instead, not because the work is any less thorough, but because the markup tied to the badge simply isn't there anymore. Owners who never think to check where a part actually comes from are the ones who end up paying for exclusivity that, mechanically speaking, was never really there in the first place. What should a prospective hypercar buyer actually take from all this? Probably not that these cars are secretly cheap to own. The engine, the carbon structure, the aerodynamics remain genuinely exclusive, expensive to engineer, and expensive to replace when something in those core systems actually fails. The lesson sits somewhere narrower and more useful. Exclusivity is unevenly distributed across a car like this, concentrated in the parts that make it fast, and largely absent from the parts that just need to function reliably. knowing which is which, turns out to be worth an enormous amount of money on its own. None of this means the Veyron's engineering is somehow less impressive where it actually counts. The quad turbocharged engine.
This is a 2,000 horsepower quad turbo V12 that makes every electric supercar look incredibly boring.
So we had also the space to put the 4 turbochargers by doing that.
The structural work that lets the car survive speeds few production vehicles have ever touched, remains as extreme as its reputation suggests. What the shared parts reveal isn't a lack of engineering. It's a business model. Extreme performance built on a foundation of components that are, in the places nobody's supposed to check, remarkably ordinary. The recall Bugatti wouldn't help fix. None of these discoveries made the actual rebuild any easier. If anything, they made Armstrong's next move more complicated, because identifying a recall and finding a workaround for a shared part are two very different problems from actually getting Bugatti to cooperate. When the team called Bugatti directly, hoping for support on a documented recall issue, the response wasn't what they'd hoped for. Dealership after dealership either declined to engage or simply never answered. Armstrong summed up the experience bluntly at one point, noting that the customer service hadn't been as fast as the cars. It's a small line, delivered almost as a throwaway joke, but it captures something real about the gap between what a brand like this promises and what an independent owner actually experiences once something goes wrong outside the dealership network. The bigger obstacle turned out to be structural rather than personal. Bugatti won't supply parts directly to anyone working outside its authorized network, which meant that even with a documented recall and a known fix in hand, Armstrong couldn't simply order the corrected component and install it himself. Why would a manufacturer make it harder to fix a car it already admitted had a known defect? Because authorized network policies aren't designed around any single repair. They're designed to keep every repair, defect or otherwise, running through official channels. And a documented recall doesn't create an exception to that rule, even when it probably should. Faced with that wall, the team settled into the same pattern that had defined the Veyron project from the start, and the Chiron rebuild before it. If the manufacturer won't provide the part gets fabricated or sourced elsewhere, evaluated on its own mechanical merits rather than its badge. It's slower than ordering from a catalog, and it carries more risk, but it's also the only path available once official channels close their doors. The parallel to the Chiron isn't accidental either. That car arrived in Armstrong's garage with a reputation as unfixable, and the response wasn't to accept that verdict. It was to keep working through each individual problem until the impossible label stopped meaning anything useful. The Veyron is following the same path for a different reason. It isn't unfixable because of any single catastrophic failure. It's difficult because the manufacturer meant to support it has made supporting it independently as hard as possible, one closed door at a time. Is there a meaningful difference between a car nobody can fix and a car nobody is allowed to fix properly? Mechanically, not much. Practically, it changes everything about how long a project like this takes. Every closed door along the way. The dealership that wouldn't answer. The parts network that wouldn't sell. The recall that wasn't quite enough. Adds another layer to a project that started as a repossessed car with a blown fuse and turned into something closer to an audit.
This just went, just stopped immediately working. So it's like a fuse blown, which I've known to blow fuses and then you put them back in and they work fine. It's just, normally if a fuse blows, it's because of a different problem.
Of how a hypercar manufacturer actually treats the people who own its cars once the original sale is finished. That's not a story Bugatti's marketing department would ever choose to tell. It's the story that happens anyway, whenever someone with enough patience decides to actually look. There's a kind of dark comedy sitting underneath the whole saga, one worth naming plainly. A $2 million hypercar dying every 2 seconds because of a part that failed on 72 other identical cars. Fixed with parts, research a determined owner did on his own time. From a manufacturer too slow to answer its own phone, about a fault it had already put in writing. Half of this car's weight might as well be in fluid, Armstrong joked at one point, and the line works as well for the whole ordeal as it did for the radiator. The rebuild isn't finished. But the mystery that started with a dying engine and ended with a stamped number in a recall filing has already answered the only question that actually mattered. The fault was real, it was documented, and it had been sitting there in plain view the entire time, waiting on a piece of stamped metal nobody thought to read. A $2 million hypercar died every 2 seconds, and the manufacturer already knew why. The proof was stamped into a part number, sitting in a filed recall the whole time. Matt Armstrong found 71 other Veyrons with the same failure, a fix that had already been installed and still hadn't worked, and a badge built on parts as ordinary as a Volkswagen hatchback underneath it all. Owning one of the world's most exclusive cars, it turns out, means owning a paper trail nobody hands you at the sale. If mysteries like this are why you're here, show it. A like, a comment on which discovery caught you off guard, and a subscribe for the next impossible rebuild.